Hey, it's Mr. Spencer. This is part 2 of our symbols and motifs exploring in The Catcher in the Rye. Last video, we talked about Jane's checker pieces. We talked about Holden's red hunting hat. We talked about the ducks in Central Park. And now we're going to move on and talk about some of the other symbols now for part 2. Okay, the one I want to get into first is violence. There's a picture of J.D. Salinger in his military cadet's uniform as a teenager. He went to several boarding schools and military boarding schools. That violence motif introduced very beginning of the book when he uses phrases like "it killed me," like I was joking, maybe I broke and was laughing at something, but he also uses it literally to describe violence. The word kill or killed is used 65 times throughout the whole novel. It builds and builds, and you got to wonder through the end of the book as you get to those final chapters, is Holden going to go savage? Is he going to have a nervous breakdown? Is he going to have a physical breakdown? Is he going to use his fists or get a hand on some sort of weapon? Is violence going to sort of captivate or culminate his final ideas? Because he's been suffering clearly from some sort of anxiety, restlessness, overthinking throughout the whole book. Okay, did the murderer of John Lennon, did he take that phrase killing literally? Mark David Chapman, still alive today. So as we move on to the next part of this violence idea, there's a photo of Salinger in his military uniform during World War II in his early 20s. He stormed the beaches of Normandy. He was carrying a gun in the infantry, D-Day, 1944, and was later promoted to staff sergeant and then worked in counterintelligence, trying to get information almost like spying on the enemy to find their positions and where the Nazis were going to go next. Okay, he mentions the committing suicide idea at the beginning of the book, overlooking that football game. He says you were supposed to commit suicide or something if your team didn't win the football game. Holden may be over-dramatizing how his school takes football so seriously at Pensy Prep. Seymour Glass, the character in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, is Salinger's most famous short story. He shoots himself at the end after spending time on the beach with the young girl Sybil, goes back to his hotel room with his wife Muriel, and kills himself. Suicide taken very literally in that short story, published before The Catcher in the Rye was ultimately published. And Holden has a very violent fantasy about a gory shootout he imagines, seemingly like some of the movies he might have watched. He claims not to like movies, but he seems influenced by them. After the Sunny prostitute and Maurice the pimp confrontation, Holden pictured himself coming out of the bathroom with an automatic gun in his pocket, staggering around with blood trickling out of his guts, leaking all over the place. So very dramatized, Holden has this fantasy. Are his fantasies inspired by the movies, or are they also inspired by maybe his own emotional disturbances? There's also this context you see of suicide and falling, a symbol and pattern of falling being repeated throughout the book. Jumping out of windows symbolized maybe an admission of failures. And in a lot of parts of American culture in the 1940s, when Salinger was writing this, there were many different historical examples of people famously jumping out of a window to commit suicide. Okay. Alger Hiss was an American government official. He was accused in 1948, the same year that A Perfect Day for Banana Fish was published, of having spied for the Soviet Union of Russia in the 1930s. He was sentenced to prison in 1950, 1 year before it was published. Okay, the Alger Hiss trials. Now, one of his associates, Marvin Smith, was noted to have worked with Alger Hiss, maybe spying for the Soviet Union against the United States. He was found dead in a stairwell of a 7-story Justice building, apparently throwing himself or falling down the stairs. Was it on purpose, or did somebody throw him? Lawrence Duggan also was accused of being involved in this communist spy ring, and he fell to his death from an office building on the 16th floor in Manhattan of New York City. And a few days later, the New York City Police Department investigated, and their final conclusion was Mr. Duggan either accidentally fell or he jumped. Okay, in chapter 24, you'll hear Mr. Antolini, one of Holden's former teachers, saying, this fall, literally, this fall, maybe physically or maybe emotionally or maybe spiritually, this fall I think you're writing for, Holden, it's a special kind of fall, a horrible kind. The man falling isn't permitted to feel or hear himself hit the bottom. He just keeps falling and falling. The whole arrangement's designed for men who, at some time or another in their lives, who are looking for something their own environment couldn't supply them with. Okay, there is that character of James Castle. He died, described by Holden in A Memory of the Book, Like a martyr to preserve truth and integrity. That James Castle character might symbolize integrity, truth. His actions show the price that you might pay for adhering to such principles. Okay, all these other Alger Hiss cases, the communists, the spying for the Soviets, there was a U.S. ambassador to England, committed suicide following a personal depression. Harry Dexter White, a heart attack. Marvin Smith, suicide. 1948, these suicides continued. 16 stories. He had one snow boot on. We talked about that in the last slide. James Forrestal, a suicide, falling to his death. U.S. Secretary of Defense, 1949. Oops, let me go back to other examples. You can see them. A lot of these have been very clearly documented in the end of the 1940s and 50s during this Cold War with the United States and the Soviets of Russia. A Harvard professor jumped to his death because of the trial of Harry Bridges. Another man, UN legal counsel, a friend of Alger Hiss, jumped out of a window when this guy lost the 1952 presidential election. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. Glass is also mentioned several times throughout the text. Similarly, the symbol of windows are mentioned 35 times in the book. Glass is associated with fragility. It's breakable, something that can shatter. And many of the references to glass in the book are literal glasses that someone wears, maybe for improved eyesight, right? Consider that glasses, though, I think they function as a way to help someone see better, or you could think figuratively to gain more insight. And they may function as a character who wears glasses might have more insight into the corruption of the world. Think of one of the nuns Holden talks to who's wearing glasses. And Holden is heavily preoccupied with this corruption of the world, and he sees through it, and he's attracted to other people. He sees through it, sees through the phoniness. Glasses are also referenced in the book in terms of drinking out of glasses, alcohol put in your glasses. Many expensive drinks or hard liquor, like whiskey or vodka, are served in glass. In chapter 9, Holden describes the two people in the hotel window he's spying through, spitting water back and forth at each other, drinking highballs, which is a mixed hard drink. And he couldn't see what they had in their glasses. The alcohol also is generally a painkiller. People use it as a painkiller. Even medical and doctors have used it through history as a painkiller. It's often associated with recklessness, though. So think about how alcohol in glasses might manifest itself in the book. Also, glass and alcohol could symbolize the fragility of one's mental health, like Holden's mental health. It can be used to self-medicate. Okay, depression, anxiety, a lot of people self-medicate their depression with alcohol. It's transparent glass. Usually you can see through glass. It could symbolize how maybe one's health is see-through, or Holden himself is transparent or see-through. You could appear naked to the outside world. People see right through you. Does Holden do a good job of hiding his emotions? Usually not. Most individuals' mental health is solid and strong, like most glass is. It's fortified throughout your life as you get older, but trauma, like his brother Ali's death, or J.D. Salinger in World War II, trauma can add cracks or fissures to the glass or your psyche. Okay, so Salinger himself, he was hospitalized after World War II, not for physical injuries, but for mental injuries. Okay, same as Seymour Glass, same as the author J.D. Salinger. Fixed that thing there. And on the surface of Catcher in the Rye, it seems Holden is most likely traumatized by Ali's death from leukemia 2 years prior to the events of the novel. Some of the symptoms Holden displays may be signs of PTSD, a post-traumatic stress. I mean, what do you think? Is this plausible? Does this make sense to you? Some of Holden's symptoms could be seen right here. You see a lot of these pop up through the book, and these are very common symptoms that can tell a doctor or a medical professional if someone is suffering from post-traumatic stress. A disorder, medical diagnosis, other examples here. Okay, in children following a trauma, these are the ones that pop up the most symptomatically. Does Holden exhibit any of these? Is Holden mentally ill? He says in chapter 1, every time he crossed a road, he felt like he was sort of disappearing. In chapter 15, he felt pretty hungry as soon as he had a cigarette. He hadn't eaten much. His loss of appetite is kind of in the subtext to the book. He eats very little. He said he had some hamburgers with Brossard and Ackley, I think around chapter 4 or 5, but it seemed like 50 years ago to Holden. He's not taking care of himself, difficulty concentrating, definitely involved in the fearfulness of paranoia. Chapter 5, he says he has trouble concentrating. Chapter 22 said it made him more depressed when his sister says, "You don't like anything that's happening." He claimed he does, and she's like, "No, you don't. You don't like schools. You don't like a million things. You don't." He tries to say he does, but boy, he says, she was depressing me. He can't even continue talking to Phoebe because the trouble was, he says, I couldn't concentrate too hot. Sometimes it's hard to concentrate, especially if you're a child suffering from trauma. His fearfulness or paranoia, his scared in chapter 6. That's how he feels about the blood on his face after the fight with Stradlater. He says he's sort of scared in chapter 9 when he's talking to the call girl, maybe trying to hire a prostitute, Faith Cavendish. And in chapter 14, he says he's scared and kind of yellow or cowardly in the confrontation with Maurice the pimp and Sonny the prostitute. God, I was scared. Chapter 17, he says, do you ever get just fed up? So scared that everything was going to go lousy unless you did something, as he talks to Sally Hayes. The word scared is used 6 different times between the last 4 chapters of the book as well. So scared, paranoia, being afraid of everything. Back to that symbol of glass breaking. If glass symbolizes fragile mental health, as I'm arguing it does, perhaps the characters who wear glasses are able to successfully manage their mental health, and they are role models for Holden. So the physical glasses they wear help signal that these are adults that have adjusted, like the nun that wears the glasses in chapter 15. Holden talks to her about Romeo and Juliet. He says she was certainly nice, and he meant it. He likes talking to them. He seems very sincere. And he says they reminded her a little bit of Ernest Morrow's mother in chapter 8, the woman on the train he enjoyed talking to. If glasses symbolize mental health, whether strong or weak mental health, Holden shatters his glass when his brother Allie dies. He says he was only 13 when it happens, and they were going to have him psychoanalyzed, but he broke all the windows in the garage, punched him out. He was bleeding all over his hand, and he still had trouble making a fist. He says he can't make a real fist anymore. So maybe the glass of the garage windows he broke represent Holden's own psyche and mental state, shattering and breaking apart. The motif of blood also pops up in some of these same ways. Similar to violence, the motif of blood is repeated at least 15 times through the novel. I counted. Bleeding itself is mentioned 6 times. In many cultures, blood symbolizes life itself, passion, emotion. The first reference to blood is the hemorrhages he said his parents would have if he wrote anything pretty personal about them. A hemorrhage is associated with blood. It's where you have a massive loss of blood. So he mentions the hemorrhage right there in the very first page of the book, introducing this motif. Another indirect reference is to the leukemia disease that his brother Allie had. Leukemia is a blood disease. The bone marrow and other blood-forming organs have an increased number of immature or abnormal leukocytes. Leukemia, that's where you get the name from. That makes it hard to produce normal blood cells, and it can lead to anemia and other symptoms. And in many cultures, blood is considered the element of divine life that functions in the human body. For instance, like the blood of Christ. In my symbolism dictionary here, we go over a few notes. Chapter 14, you see, I'd walk down holding onto my guts, the fantasy he had after the confrontation with Maurice the pimp. In many religious cultures, blood is considered the element of divine life that functions in the human body. So, for Christian imagery, it represents the sacrament of communion. Members of a church become imbued with the purifying and saving power of the blood of the Savior. Holden says in that same chapter, I like Jesus and all, but I don't care too much for most of the other stuff in the Bible. Again and again throughout myths and religious stories, blood is referred to as having magic power in all sorts of cultures. It's thought of the exclusive food of supernatural beings, like gods or even vampires. There's ideas related to blood brotherhoods, blood vengeance, blood baptism, baptism of a martyr, the blood, the bad blood, blood on his hands, bloodthirsty, stigmata for Jesus. It's notable that Holden's brother Allie died of that blood disease, and leukemia was also considered sometimes a fatal final consequence of the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So those are just some of the connections between Allie, leukemia, blood, martyrdom, Jesus Christ, and Holden Caulfield and his sort of fascination with being bloodied and beaten up. Back to the falling pattern. Like I said, we'd come back to this. On page 188, Holden describes the death of James Castle in chapter 22. So he's thinking, he can't concentrate. He's talking to his sister Phoebe. All he could think about were those two nuns. Remember, one of those wore glasses. And he's thinking of this boy he knew at Elkton Hills, another school he used to go to that he got kicked out of. He says there was this one boy at Elkton Hills named James Castle that wouldn't take back something about this very conceited boy, Phil Stabile. James Castle called him a very conceited guy, and one of Stabile's lousy friends went and squealed on him to Stabile. So to Stabile, with about 6 other dirty B words that Holden says, they went down to James Castle's room, they went in, locked the gosh damn door, they tried to make him take back what he said, but he wouldn't do it. Take back what you said, do it now. So Holden says they started in on him. I won't even tell you what they did to him, it's too repulsive. But he still wouldn't take it back. Old James Castle, you should have seen him. He was a skinny little weak-looking guy. His wrists were about as big as pencils. We get references to Stabile, like stabbing, small wrists, which reminds me of when Jesus was crucified through the wrists, stabbed with huge nails, described in the New Testament of the Bible. And finally, what he did, instead of taking back what he said to escape this assault, this James Castle jumped out of a window. Holden was in the shower, but he heard him land outside. Almost like the death of Jesus, people heard it far away, not just in place, but far away in time. People have heard about the death of Jesus for 2,000 years now. Holden heard it while he was in the shower. He thought somebody dropped a desk or a radio or something. He ran downstairs, and old James Castle, note, same initials as Jesus Christ, J.C., James Castle, laying on the stone steps. He was dead, and his teeth and his blood were all over the place. He had a turtleneck sweater on I'd lent him. Holden gave him something. All they did with the guys that were in the room was expel them. They didn't even go to jail. Holden feels like there's no justice in the world. Okay, innocence is lost. This guy's life is lost. And those guys don't really have any major punishment. They get expelled from the school, though, but Holden still feels like it wasn't strong enough punishment. Justice not truly served. Holden was clean. He was in the shower. There's this dynamic between dirtiness versus cleanliness, being stained versus being pure, maybe symbolizing the loss of innocence. James Castle was harassed. He would preserve the truth. He preserves integrity. He represents truth and integrity to Holden at this moment where his sister Phoebe is pressuring Holden to just name something that he likes. The initials, the same as Jesus Christ, I said. Other critics have noted this. I'm not the first person to come up with this. Maybe you don't think that's important, but notice Holden also contemplated suicide in a similar manner after Maurice the pimp took his money and hit him, if you look on page 16. This image of jumping out of the window not only connects Holden with James Castle, but also maybe epitomizes the fall that Holden is under, the spiritual fall. And the catcher in the rye falling off the cliff, catching them in the rye field, the children he describes in that metaphor that the title of the book's named after. Holden wants to save the innocent. Dig deeper. Don't let the analysis of the symbolism intimidate you. You can read this book however you like, but I'm encouraging you to hunt for the symbolism. Find meaning in life, just like you can find meaning in this book, but you got to hunt for it. You got to search for meaning yourself. What other symbols can you find? What are you going to write in your final essay? Okay, you will have a timed writing where you have to explore some of these themes and symbols, but you'll get to choose which ones you want to focus on. I've tried to give you so many ideas just to get the gears in your brain working in the right direction. This is Mr. Spencer signing off.